hands together for Andrew.
Just in the nick of time, eh? Alright. Okay, thanks for that, Adam. So, zombie rights. I've just heard from Meredith about the social, political issues related to technology. And there's no doubt that some abstract areas of philosophy, or areas that have been rather academic, have the potential to become far more political in the coming years. Particularly when we start dealing with issues like artificial intelligence and whole brain emulation, perhaps. And if there's a joker in the pack that comes up every time, it's got to be consciousness. So I want to say a little bit about that today. I will just initially preface what I'm going to say by saying that a large amount of this will be very familiar to you, particularly if you know the work of Daniel Dennett and David Chalmers. So I'm going to run through a particular narrative about this debate, and then towards the end add in some remarks of my own. So maybe we have a scenario in the not too distant future where entities that are at least putatively considered to be zombies are treated in a discriminatory way. And we end up with a debate about which things are or are not conscious in the world, at least in the sense in which we think is important to us. We know that in recent years we've had this history of sequential rights revolutions, which have been very important. They're not over yet. And so I want to put out there the possibility that zombie rights, or at least the rights of entities that might putatively be branded as zombies, could be one of the next stages in this history. I will get to a slightly more concrete definition of what I'm actually talking about with zombies, but certainly when we look at the topics that come up at a gathering like this, we can see that there's a broad range of candidates for things that may or may not be considered to be intelligent, to be considered to be conscious. And of course, strictly speaking, we need to include ourselves in this list. So there's certainly an intuition that when we're talking about ethics and we're talking about values, something or other called consciousness matters. We want to know what to say about this thing. And there's a pretty good intuition in there that consciousness is a necessary property of things that suffer, maybe. And at least for some things that have agency, that can go out there and do things that are either good or bad. And there's also this cluster of ideas: identity, selfhood, intentionality, and even just focus and attention, where consciousness often crops up as a concept. So what is it that we're talking about? There are many different dictionary definitions of consciousness, but we're certainly not playing with all of them here. We want to pin down to a quite precise philosophical definition. And maybe if we open up the head of our zombie and take a look, we'll find that there's something very obvious not there, or perhaps it is just a putative zombie and it is conscious. And if we look at it carefully enough, we'll be able to detect the consciousness within that we care about. Let's define consciousness for the purposes of this talk in terms of two categories. Now, These categories are cut up in different ways in the literature. I don't want to be too specific about a definition. The broad duality here is relatively clear. So we have this objective psychological notion of consciousness, and we know that some of these sorts of things seem to come into it. And what you'll see here is a set of psychological traits, and we seem to understand that these things can be pretty well characterized in terms of brain function. We might not know exactly how, but we have these sets of scientific instruments, and we're pretty sure that these sorts of ideas relate to the way in which the brain functions. But then there's this other thing. This notion that no matter what we say about that first category, there's this second category, this subjective category. And top of that list is a single term, and it's a term that has come up in the last day or so, qualia. That within our experience, we apprehend these properties, which are properties just of our experience, which we can't characterize in terms of the physical functional world, in terms of the relationships that science maps out for us. So these are properties that seem to have intrinsic qualities to them that just are as they are. Could be the redness of red, the intrinsic colour property that you encounter when you perceive redness. It could be the painfulness of a pain, that intrinsic raw feel inside the experience of pain that makes pain what it is. It could also be something a bit more high level. It could be perhaps the unified sense of what it's like to be in this room right now, participating in Singularity Summit 2012. So I'll offer you this characterization from Chalmers. We're talking about truths about what it is like to be a subject that are not entailed a priori by the physical and functional truth about that subject. So when we're talking about rights, which do we think is important in these two definitions? Apologies for my particularly shambolic Venn diagram. We have a cluster, perhaps, of beings that enjoy objective consciousness in some sense, at least conceptually in the logical space, and a set of beings that also enjoy subjective consciousness, and then maybe really lucky beings in the middle that enjoy both, we would hope. We tend to think of ourselves in this way. Now, when we're considering which systems are, or which entities are conscious or otherwise, and when we're considering whole brain emulation or artificial intelligence or cyborgs, hybrid intelligences, intelligence augmentation, it's inevitable that when we go out to the man on the street and perhaps the man in this room, because there are very, very valid arguments against the notion that some of these things will be conscious, maybe that all of them will be conscious. There are a set of positions that, well, to go through them, they're non-naturalistic worldviews. And we know what those entail. There are specific philosophical views, for example, Searle's biological materialism, which would at least cut out some of these categories. There's a sense of general uncertainty about consciousness that we all share at least some of the time. But if we're looking to really formalize the debate, perhaps the key thing here is the conceivability of zombies. The conceivability of entities that are not conscious, and I'll pin that down in just one moment. And that's what I want to focus on here. So, enter the zombie. No, I don't want to be cruel to Daniel Dennett at all, but I'm not the first one to attempt to make a joke about Dennett being a zombie, and maybe we'll see why in a little while. I want you to think about your zombie twin. Okay, so Chalmers being the perhaps name best associated with the zombie concept. This is a definition from him. Your zombie twin is a creature that's molecule for molecule, identical to you. They're identical in all the low-level properties postulated by a complete physics, but entirely lacking in conscious experience. The argument goes that this is a conceivable notion, that conceptually this makes sense to us as a possibility. And if this is a possibility, then it makes it very hard for us to be able to authoritatively bring consciousness into a rational conversation about entities, and leaves this debate about rights wide open. So may I suggest momentarily you glance at the person next to you, maybe furtively, and consider the fact that perhaps they are a zombie. You may not doubt that you are a zombie, but maybe you want to entertain that notion too. Can you be sure? Do you really know that you are conscious? If we entertain this kind of doubt, we want to think about how we might at least consider what is a zombie and what isn't. A key conceptual tool that's often used here is the notion of supervenience. So, a high-level property supervenes on a low-level property if there are no two possible situations that are identical with respect to their low-level properties while differing in their high-level properties. This is a notion of logical supervenience as opposed to natural supervenience. If consciousness is merely a supervenient property that supervenes on characteristics of brain states, then we should be able to expect to predict whether a system is conscious if we do know its full physical characterization. So the zombie hypothesis suggests to us that consciousness does not logically supervene on the physical.
Sorry, can you just explain what that means again? What supervenience and supervene mean?
Sure. So a property will supervene on another property. So for example, the pressure of gas in a container is in a sense a property that supervenes on the motion of the gas molecules inside the container. There's no sense in which we don't know the supervenient property if we know the properties of the underlying low-level properties. So this table is, in a sense, supervening on the molecular properties of the object that it constitutes. And we've looked at this notion then of logical and natural supervenience. So the question is, if zombies are conceivable, and if consciousness doesn't supervene on the physical, then do zombies know they are zombies? If we have systems that look and act and think like us, but they're not conscious, do they know they're not conscious? Well, it wouldn't seem to be the case that they can know they're not conscious. We have the putative zombie interacting with the world, with a physical space. And we know scientifically that this interaction is causally closed. It's a closed loop. There may be some sense in which the phenomenal space, the experience, supervenes on what's going on in the zombie's brain. But there's no causal feedback there. So a consequence of this is that a zombie will claim to be conscious, at least a putative conceivable zombie. And this is exactly what we would expect. The zombie is just like you or I. It says all the things that you or I would say, including making claims about consciousness and maybe even doing philosophy about consciousness to try and figure out what consciousness is, even though it doesn't know what consciousness is because it's a zombie. So this is a paradox, it would seem. And Chums characterises this as the paradox of phenomenal judgment. Can we resolve this paradox in some way? If there's no causal basis for us, for our brains to know that we're conscious, can we still, in some sense, be said to really authoritatively know that we are conscious? Chalmers argues that there is a concept called acquaintance and that this can do work here, and we'll come back to that and take a look at that. We consider that, at least on this picture, even your brain doesn't know that it's conscious in this sense. Given that all of our brains are causally closed systems, if consciousness does not logically supervene on the physical, then our brains are functioning exactly the same way that zombie brains are functioning. So when you turn and look at the person next to you, that person is a zombie in this sense. At least their brain is a zombie, their personality is a zombie, and the same thing with you when you look in the mirror. If this is the correct conception of consciousness, your brain doesn't know that it's conscious. Your thoughts don't have access to that information. So this is a puzzle. Now we can look at whether the steps to resolve this puzzle can succeed. First of all, maybe we want to consider that we're barking up the wrong tree here. This is our zombie dog barking at a dualist tree. And everything that I've been saying really presupposes that intuitive dualistic notion, and certainly this notion is perhaps a naturally emerging psychological trait for human beings. Even though we've pinned down a slightly more formal distinction in terms, or definition about consciousness here, certainly there's a Cartesian mind-body separation intuition that goes way back through history. And just because we have that intuition and just because it works for us in the everyday sense doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be correct. And certainly the consensus position in the philosophical world for most of the 20th century has not entertained the ideas that we've just been speaking about. It's really been materialism and ontological monism. So this is just the view that there is just one kind of stuff, and that's the physical stuff that the natural world is made out of, that is described by physics. So, everything that we might discuss when we talk about consciousness must necessarily, on this view, be characterizable in terms of that single kind of stuff. So here we come back to Dennett, and Dennett is by no means the only monist materialist around, but his defense of materialism is a very strong one. And Dennett speaks about heterophenomenology. Quite a long word, but what he's really talking about is looking at all these concepts from an objective external position, looking at the phenomenology of others. And really we have the method for this. This is just what we do by default. We apply psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, and we come up with ways of explaining and understanding the behaviour of other beings, including their propensity to make statements like, I am conscious, or when I experience red, there is a subjective, ineffable raw feel to that I cannot describe in terms of any underlying quantitative characteristic. The heterophenomenologist can come along and say, aha, well, I can understand why you're making that claim. But that doesn't mean that there really is that feel there. So, what is the feel? What does the heterophenomenologist say? What does Dennett say? Well, Dennett wrote a very long book on this question, Consciousness Explained, and Dennett reveals a large amount about cognitive science. But in a sense, Dennett's thesis can be pinned down to this one paragraph in the book. And moreover, it can really be pinned down to a sentence within this paragraph. So this quale of yours, this pain, this red experience, is just a complex of dispositions. So what does Dennett mean here by a complex of dispositions? Well, he means that this is a very rich content. We don't have a single conceptual way of thinking about what a colour is in terms of our mental content, or what a pain is, but we can say that there is a long conjunctive sentence of behavioural dispositions that arise in relation to this kind of content. Redness might make us feel a certain way, we might associate it with certain experiences, we might perceive it as, in terms of danger, we might associate it with other qualities, tastes, things that taste red. We might equate emotions with redness. We might think about particular canonical things that we would regard as being red. And there's so much bound up around this idea of redness and this aesthetic property that we start, rather than entertaining all that content in our moment-to-moment thoughts, we regard, in a sense, this experience as singular, as inevitable and intrinsic, and of just having a feel that characterises it immediately and crystally. But it's not that. That's just a sort of a psychological coding for a rich point in our experience. And likewise with pains, and with the kind of qualia that we might especially associate with ethical significance. So, is that the end? It could be. Certainly, for many people, for many philosophers, that is going to be enough, and that remains a consensus position for many. It's certainly consistent with scientific practice. It gives us a nice ontological worldview. We don't have a paradox of phenomenal judgment here, because we can understand how we comprehend our consciousness in terms of the underlying brain states that relate to our conscious experiences. And maybe that's enough. But there's a worry. And Chalmers perhaps pinpoints this worry here when speaking about Dennett's characterisation of heterophenomenology. I should really try not to use that word. Chalmers says Dennett's theory equivocates between a psychological and phenomenal sense of the word seem. So right in the language that we use to talk about these things, the intuitions that we're battling with are entrenched. Dennett explains the judgments about the stimuli, but he doesn't actually explain the explananda, the thing that needs explaining. So simply explaining judgments about consciousness for Chalmers is not enough. We still have to explain the experiences themselves. And on this view, there's more there to be explained than just the physical dispositional states. So let's consider uploads or whole brain emulations for a moment. There's a dilemma here. Perhaps you're considering a whole brain emulation as a way to carry on once your physical brain gets a bit rough around the edges. But you have this worry. Will my upload just be a piece of software in some way? A zombie me? A very good software simulation of my cognitive dynamics, but not really me. Won't be me inside that. There won't be an I, there won't be a set of experiences with intrinsic qualities. Well, it at least seems conceivable that this could be the case. And this conceivability goes, again, psychologically way back for us as a species. And it feeds into those notions about whether we should, for example, regard whole brain emulations or certain kinds of artificial intelligences as conscious entities that we should treat with concern and respect. But there's a key question. If this is conceivable, and it seems conceivable, should we regard it as being possible? And there certainly is space to make a distinction between conceivability and possibility here. But the view on this is far from one of consensus. Chalmers will certainly defend the view that if a zombie is conceivable, then it is possible. Dennett's pretty much left the room at this point. But there is another class of theorists, the physicalists, who deny this move. So their strategy is to say, well, yes, the zombie is conceivable, but there are reasons to think that even though the conceivability adds up, the possibility is still precluded. We don't need to worry about actual zombies being around. So Chalmers has characterised this position as type B materialism, otherwise known as physicalism. And two key claims for the physicalists. Consciousness is physical, and therefore zombies are not possible. But it's also irreducible. So the physicalist wants to have it both ways a little bit here. Now, physicalism is controversial. It's usually defended in terms of something called strong metaphysical necessity. And there's not time or space enough to go into that right here. But all I need or want to make the point about here is that this is a controversial defense, and it doesn't work for everyone. And one could argue that this defense is made simply because of the sense that a defense of this kind has to be made. The solution has to look at this, so we have to find a way to make it work. So the impetus to have a solution that looks like this becomes fairly clear in terms of the debate that we've put together. We don't want a paradox of phenomenal judgment. We don't want to have this weird ontological gap, but we do want to defend the notion, maybe, that the physical characterization of experience leaves something out. And this also feeds into the don't have a clue camp, and arguably we have both don't have a clue physicalists and don't have a clue materialists. This dilemma. We can take qualia seriously, but we have this epistemological gap where it would seem that our brains can't actually know that we're conscious, or at least any defense of the view that they can in the absence of any, or in the presence of a physically closed causal system is controversial. Or we can reject this epistemic gap, but then it would seem at least that we risk leaving something out of the picture about consciousness. So in a sense we're choosing ontology or epistemology, but we don't seem to be able to get both. So where does this leave our poor zombie? Our zombie's getting a little confused at this point. He can't even do a question mark the right way around. Okay, let's say our zombie is a materialist, and he wants to defend his rights on that basis. Well, certainly ethics is no simple thing, and when we're considering ethics, there's a host of factors that we need to consider. But for the materialist here, there are no metaphysical puzzles. We take this heterophenomenological approach, perhaps, to subjective experience, including suffering, and we assess the ethics and rights of an individual or an entity in terms of the cognitive, behavioural, psychological, sociological roles that it plays. And in a sense, this does mirror the existing approach that we generally take, though, of course, in the day-to-day world, there is still a lot of folk psychological ideas about the ghost in the machine or the soul or whatever it happens to be. And even though those ideas are not the consciousness idea that we've been talking about here, they're not too far removed. They still feed into this intuition that people, for example, are not simply physical systems. For the dualist, it's a little bit more complicated. How do we assess the ethical significance of a conscious entity? There seems to be this sense in which the self is bifurcated. Do we want to consider just the rights of the physical self, the brain? Do we want to consider the rights of just the non-physical self, just the consciousness bit, whatever that is? Is there some sense in which we must consider them together? Well, let's firstly look at what we might call the ethical significance of pure experiences. Let's take that part that isn't the physical self, that's just exclusively the phenomenal self. Let's consider a pain in a box. So here we just have this thing that kind of sits in a box and goes, ouch, all day. Unfortunately for it, no one would really want to be this pain in a box, but that's part of the problem. Pain in the box isn't actually attached to an identity. It's not attached to any thoughts. It's not attached to anything. It's not attached to a point in time or space in experience. This is just a phenomenal property. It's like the phenomenal equivalent of an atom floating in space. Now, this pain seems to be suffering. It doesn't make sense to us that this is, for example, a more ethically important entity than your zombie neighbour in your current row, who perhaps is your good friend, has good conversation with you, makes commitments, engages in social practices, but perhaps, just perhaps, doesn't actually have the lights on inside. Which do we think is more significant here? If we think that what really matters when it comes to ethics is simply the intrinsic properties of our conscious experience, completely denuded of everything else, then we're going to have to worry more about the pain in the box than anything else. And that kind of seems weird, at least that seems weird to me. There seems to be something a little absurd, in fact, about that. But the story doesn't end here. Let's look momentarily at phenomenal concepts, that is, the actual concepts we entertain about our phenomenal experiences. And there's at least two ways to constitute these. And the important thing is here that Chalmers' notion of phenomenal concept is an attempt to bind the physical with the phenomenal, so that we don't have this bifurcation, that when we're considering the properties of consciousness, we are forced to simultaneously consider the physical and the phenomenal. I'll look at this briefly. I want to make the case that this doesn't work, or at least that it's not obvious that it works, and it's not obvious that we shouldn't be looking for yet a different approach. But it does seem that we can have both an inflationary and a deflationary notion of phenomenal concepts. So the deflationary notion is just the notion of a phenomenal concept as explained in terms of the physical characteristics of our brains. The inflationary notion is that notion that adds consciousness in on top. So we want to get this binding between the two things. Within a phenomenal concept, there's this notion of an underlying quality. And in the deflationary picture, this is understood in heterophenomenological terms, perhaps. Now, a contention within this view would be that phenomenal properties such as pain only have ethical significance where they're associated with what Chalmers would call a direct phenomenal concept. And I'll just go back one, because I think the definition will help here. A direct phenomenal concept is a concept that's partly constituted by an underlying phenomenal quality, in that the content will mirror the quality, picking out instances of the quality in all epistemic possibilities. And the content co-varies to mirror the quality as the quality changes. My argument to you would be that there is this notion that we have a deflationary scoop when it comes to these phenomenal concepts. We know that for any concept there is a psychological analogue, the concept just taken in terms of its deflationary physical properties. And when we think about any concept in that full inflationary sense, our thoughts about that concept themselves have a physical analogue. So we keep being able to pull a physical content away from any experience, no matter how richly constituted it would seem to be. And we end up with this sensation that we're chasing the raw feel of our experience down a conceptual rabbit hole. So this binding, where we take up the intrinsic properties of our experiences into concepts, seems troubled on this notion. There is always going to be a heterophenomenological way to describe whatever it is that we perceive as being intrinsic at a given moment in time. So this conceptual constitution is troubled in that the phenomenal property, no matter how we look at it, always ends up seeming to be surplus to requirements. And in this sense, we can't quite pull the qualia back from that disembodied pain in a box situation. We want the qualia to matter, but they're out there. They are beyond the causal closure of the physical. And sophisticated philosophical tap dancing doesn't necessarily seem like it is going to pull them back in for us. We already know, or at least have the intuition, that rights should be based in things like relationships, goals, commitments, actions, and perhaps also experiences. But those experiences, no matter how deeply we look into them, can always be pulled back into a physical characterization. And so in this view, there's a contention that the psychological facts should be sufficient for our ethical appraisals of entities, no matter whether we take a dualistic, materialistic or physicalistic view of consciousness. We have the same toolbox to work with. Okay, let's take one last look at the notion that we can blend these properties. This is the notion of acquaintance. An acquaintance dates back in philosophical literature, though it's a term that's kind of been updated over time in various contexts. But for Chalmers, acquaintance is not a conceptual relation, it's what makes certain sorts of concepts possible and makes certain sorts of justification possible. So phenomenal concepts and phenomenal knowledge require not just acquaintance, but acquaintance in the right cognitive background. And furthermore, acquaintance makes possible the formation for Chalmers of these pure phenomenal concepts. So that pure phenomenal concepts embody a certain sort of lucid understanding of phenomenal properties. This is perhaps as far down this philosophical explanation as we get. This is getting to the bedrock of it. So the best words we have here is a certain sort of lucid understanding. And that certain sort of lucid understanding would seem to be a lucidity that includes by definition a phenomenal experience along with a concept that has a structure that embodies that experience. But the lucidity in itself is nonetheless premised on the dualistic view. And we know that any kind of lucid understanding can, in another sense, be embodied by heterophenomenology. So we're moving in circles just a little. Chalmers wants to say the question is not whether I am justified in the belief, or in fact it is whether I'm justified in the belief, but not whether my brain is justified. And if property dualism is correct, there's more to me than my brain. But the case that I want to suggest it to you is that this is a case of not whether there's a brain and something else, but a brain or something else. We do have this bifurcated self. And if we have this bifurcation, then there's a sense that we need to consider the rights of two separate selves, not one combined entity. And we could grant these separate selves rights distinctly, but again we seem to be coming back to a very difficult and odd position, and maybe a slightly absurd position. And maybe we again want to change tack. Now, I could end here, and I could at least suggest to you that there is a strong reason, as I've already put it, that we could at least have a psychological consensus about ethics, that for materialists, physicalists and dualists, metaphysical concerns should cancel out of the equation here. That we can evaluate systems simply in terms of the physical properties in a way that should be acceptable to those of any philosophical persuasion with regard to their intuitions about consciousness. And I think this is a very important, neutral kind of result. It suggests that there's a way forward. But in the remaining time, I want to go out on a limb just a little bit and ask whether we can do better. Whether we just have to swallow this pill or whether we can go further. We want to do these three things, and it doesn't seem like we've been able to do them so far. We want to take qualia seriously, we want to avoid the epistemic problems of dualism, and we want to defend an intuitive view of conceivability. So we would like to believe that if something is conceivable, then in most circumstances it's possible. What this means is that if we want to preclude the zombie hypothesis, we have to perhaps find a reason why our zombie hypothesis is not a valid conception, why there's something wrong with it. Let's revisit physicalism. We knew that physicalism was motivated by this kind of thing, but it didn't really seem to have maybe a clear argument, notwithstanding those who would take strong metaphysical necessity as a good defence for it. So can we defend a view more formally where that conceivability relationship holds, qualitative states do exist, so a phenomenal realism view, zombies are not possible because zombies are not conceivable? What might we have missed in our assumption, in our conception of zombies? Well, here are 4 candidates. One is that when we conceived zombies, we started with the physical world. We gave ourselves the physical world for free. We assumed that there was some sort of hierarchy in our ontology between physical and phenomenal states. We kind of brought in supervenience and guessed that that must matter somehow. And we assumed that we needed to come up with a single ontologically consistent picture of reality. But there are 2 different ways to look at reality here. We can start with physical realism, with the physical world as primary, and we can start with solipsism. And one way of characterising solipsism is that the phenomenal world is primary. Now, no one really takes solipsism seriously in a day-to-day sense, and that's probably a very good thing. But if we want to be philosophically rigorous, there's a sense in which both of these are equally reasonable starting points. So which is more correct? Is there any reason we should go for the physical first? There's a sense in which if we do take the physical world as primary, then physicality is necessary but perhaps not sufficient for phenomenality. This comes back to the notion that hypothetically God had more work to do after he created the physical world in order to add in the world of consciousness, in order to add in that ontology. And that phenomenality, that consciousness is sufficient but not necessary for the physical world. If we have consciousness, then we must have a physical world because in some sense consciousness supervenes on the physical. And of course, if we take the phenomenal world as primary, we get the reverse ontology, that phenomenality is necessary but not sufficient for the physical, because within the phenomenal domain there seems to be this representation of an external world. And again, the representation of the external world is sufficient but not necessary for phenomenality. It seems like we could have, again, a phenomenality that's just an all-encompassing experience of flashing yellow, or, again, a pain in a box. So there's this symmetry there. And there's a sense in which the actual ontological and epistemic gaps that we've been playing with are themselves symmetric. It does seem reasonable to formulate a paradox of physical judgment from the phenomenal perspective. We can ask questions about absent physicalia in the same way that we'd ask questions about absent qualia, or indeed inverted qualia. There's a sense in which we could think about how the constitution of physical properties from the phenomenal perspective could be inverted. Now, Chalmers has noted that we need, in some deeper sense, some intrinsic properties to make sense of the physical world, while we also need to find a place for the intrinsic properties revealed in phenomenology. So, while we're not supporting the naturalistic dualist vision here, there is definitely a sense in which the 2 ontologies perhaps have a place for each other. And there's also a question about realism here. We have a concern that if we merely have a physical ontology, that phenomenal properties are not really real with regard to that physical ontology, and vice versa for phenomenal states. It seems that from a purely solipsistic point of view, I can't ever really reach out into the physical world. In an everyday sense, I regard the physical world as real, but there is a skeptical gap there. Nonetheless, on each side of the equation, we know that there's a rich representation. So, in terms of heterophenomenology, this rich set of dispositions renders what we consider to be phenomenal states sort of real. We know we can go down that rabbit hole and trace and characterize our phenomenal experiences in very deep ways, and anything we want to say about them, we can say about them, which tells us that they are conceptualized and characterized in terms of physical information in physical space. And likewise, we can do that for the notion of an external objective world as it strikes us from a solipsistic position. Now, this is all very well and good. And I'll skip over symmetric representation. I think you get the impression of what I mean there. But I want to leave you with this idea that we can borrow something here from quantum mechanics. Now, I do not want to put across the notion here that what I'm suggesting is a quantum mechanical view of qualia. There are those sorts of views out there. I'm just merely drawing inspiration from complementarity that we see in wave-particle duality. Here's a quote from Bohr about the way in which systems have different properties depending on how we observe them, and many of you will be familiar with double-slit diffraction experiments, which readily illustrate this wave-particle duality. And grabbing this nice, concise little definition from Wikipedia, we have this principle that states that some objects have multiple properties that appear to be contradictory. So even though there is some defense for the notion that waves and particles can be the same thing, there is a fairly strong defense as well for the notion that they are ontologically dissimilar, but that the system displays these characteristics in complementary ways under different circumstances. So we might ask ourselves whether we can kill off zombies simply by treating all reality in a manner that is analogous in that experiment to the complementary treatment of photons. Is it that qualia and physicalia are somehow complementary in a broader system, in a broader characterization of reality, so that reality, to put it in a nutshell, equals two different things but not at the same time? If we have a physical system, then phenomenal states are sort of real. If we have that phenomenal solipsistic yardstick, then physical states are sort of real. There's sort of an objective world out there. Does this give us something over and above the simultaneous supervenience-based relationship? How would we apply this in practice? We need to know which physical entities will have phenomenal correlates for a start. That would be helpful. And I want to make a natural suggestion here that intentional states are to be found in both the physical domain and the phenomenal domain. There's obviously been a lot of treatment of what intentionality is in physical systems. That is, intentionality can broadly be typified as representationality. And there's also been some good defence, for example, the work of Horgan and Tiensen, that the phenomenal domain is also richly intentional and informational, but the characterisation of intentionality and information in the two domains varies. So what I want to suggest here is that we have a cogent view available where physical intentionality will, on this worldview, imply phenomenal intentionality because we simply assume that reality has this mirror-like symmetry. We don't need to posit a supervenience relation that somehow arbitrarily ties different types of ontologies to each other. And this has something in common with the dual aspect ontology suggested by Chalmers and it from bit ontology, where information experiences information from the inside and physics is information from the outside. But of course it's important to note that here we're not talking necessarily about information as some tertiary third ontological category, but we're merely drawing a correlation between information or intentionality as it exists in its unique form in the phenomenal domain with how it would exist in the physical domain. Very quickly and finally, I just want to suggest that taking this view, there might be consequences for our interpretation of some quantum phenomena. For example, we may find that we could have actually a complementary view of a many minds hypothesis with a many worlds hypothesis existing at the same time. This has no real consequences for the view I'm talking about, but it might be an interesting outcome. So I can't prove that this is the case, this complementary dualism. But what is important, I believe, here is the notion that this could be a cogent way of looking at phenomenality that answers to the theoretical needs that we previously outlined. It precludes zombies. It supports a notion of phenomenal realism without an unnecessary ontological complexity. So in a sense, it's quite parsimonious. It doesn't assume any particular world comes into the picture for free, whether it's the physical or phenomenal world, but assumes that there's a natural symmetry between the two. And most importantly, it comes back and supports that intuition about conscious systems, which says that we can still evaluate conscious states confidently in terms of the everyday heterophenomenological characteristics of conscious systems, so that putative zombie rights, or rights of systems that may putatively be zombies, can really be characterised just in terms of everyday universal rights. So the physical rights are enough, and if we want to go down the complementary dualism path, we get the realism that we want without the fear of the zombie hypothesis. And perhaps, in view of this, we can have a system where our zombies all change their tack and march with pride rather than fear. So thanks for your attention.
Look, I'd like to suggest that we allow some time for questions, although it is now officially 12, which is break time. For those who are interested in having some questions, is that okay? Yeah. Welcome to stay, and of course anybody who needs to go and have a drink or something is welcome to as well. So can I open the floor to questions? Anybody got any questions? Okay, Ray.
When I hear this kind of discussion, about halfway through I get to feel that what we're doing is doing gymnastics with words. It's always a problem because structures of words are self-referential, and in philosophy we keep inventing new words. And then right down the middle we talk about the clarity which is related to sorta.
Yeah.
Now how can you have clarity which is sorta? And the worry is that you could have made any statement at the end and I would say, wow, there are about 1 million conclusions you could come to, and I don't know which one is the best one to accept. So this is a worry. So even in Chalmers' definition of the zombie twin, you said they're identical but different. Doesn't that mean that we're changing what we mean by the word identical?
Well, physically,
it follows that if you're identical but different, you're talking about something outside the measures of identicality, and of course, because we don't specify them, it's no wonder we can't discuss it.
Sure. It's certainly the case that this kind of discussion can be frustrating and can become very involved and can become entrenched in language. In terms of Chalmers' distinction, it wasn't merely a distinction saying that they're identical but different. They're identical in one way, that they're physically identical, but I think the distinction there is relatively clear, that there is potentially more to ontology than the mere physical world, so that you're just saying that one part of what characterises them is identical, that is all the ontological parts that are physical, but all the ontological parts that are non-physical are distinct. In terms of the sorta thing, not too much was writing on that. That was really meant to just give a characterisation of the notion that there is a rich representation of one kind of ontology within another, even if that representation doesn't necessarily seem to add up to the actual thing in itself. It remains a representation. But look, I take your point, and part of the problem in a presentation like this as well is that it's much more breadth than depth, and so my hope is that maybe I've given you a flavour of how the argument goes, but I certainly admit that there's a million points along this narrative where it's possible to go much deeper, and where, for many tastes, it may be that the argument falls.
Okay.
I still am not sure about superviolence, what it is.
Supervenience.
Supervenience, sorry.
Yeah, okay, so supervenience is, we can characterise logical with natural supervenience and local with global supervenience, but supervenience is just looking at how properties are entailed by one another. So generally, for example, we'd see chemistry as supervenient on physics. I think the example I gave before wasn't too great. We know that, for example, maybe not all the terms in chemistry map perfectly onto terms in physics, because we want the idea in science is that terms provide the most high level and compressed understanding of a subject matter for predictive purposes that are possible. But we know that globally, if not locally, the terminology in chemistry sits on top of, is compatible with the terminology of physics, and that the phenomena within chemistry are products and consequences of the phenomena that is described within physics of the physical world. So the laws of physics ultimately give us the laws of chemistry. So chemistry supervenes on physics in that sense.
Related or based on? Is that what you're saying?
It's actually that the properties themselves are consequences of lower level properties. Yeah, so biology supervenes on chemistry too, and societies supervene on physics as well, but these are very high level entities.
Yep, I've got a couple of questions. First of all, regarding the practical significance of thoughts, does it actually make any difference to me if you are a zombie, if you actually act identically to how you would act if you were not a zombie? My second question, if I can ask too, is what do you think of Occam's razor as a way of dealing with Chalmers' zombie twin?
Okay, so in terms of Occam's razor, the Chalmers' response to that would simply be that, I believe this was an Einstein quote, we should make everything as simple as possible, but no simpler. And there is a sense in which if we simply embrace the materialist ontology, we've gone too far, because consciousness is a brute entity that requires explanation. It's a fundamental property, and it's not something that needs to be explained in order to explain something else. So that in the picture, we've oversimplified. So that would be the response to Occam's razor there. There is a sense in which that ontology seems complicated though, and my hope is that this symmetric, complementary view may actually simplify the ontology. In terms of the first question about significance, certainly the argument that I would want to make is that even if we support a view where zombies are conceivable and possible and maybe actual, and I think it's important to note that even though some philosophers will defend the notion that zombies are possible, including Chalmers, there's almost no one really defending the notion that zombies are actual. They're still kind of devices for thought experiments. But even in that case, that there is a consistent methodological approach that we should take to ethical questions, which effectively factors that out as an important consideration, so that we can keep attending to our common sense everyday notions about what makes a difference without having to get super concerned about the notion that there might be some metaphysical other realm which is going to create some enormous difference in value between entities that are otherwise putatively conscious. Of course, there is also a sort of broader sociological concern about how this debate would translate, following on from what Meredith was saying, into the broader man-on-the-street context. And certainly, it would seem to me that we do need ways of responding to that everyday notion of a kind of dualistic conception of the self, which would likely come into play in the broader social conversation about things like, for example, whole brain emulation or artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I kind of say that's a very useful metaphor about complementarity. I take it the analogue of the mental being a particle and the physical is a way of function in that it's present everywhere. What I wanted to suggest is kind of thought experiment. One of the problems of thinking of laws of the mental, and that's what you're moving on to, that effectively still is a kind of dual aspect theory, is that the mental at the moment is only very sporadically present. Now, as this is a singularity conference, if we could imagine almost point over the future where intelligence is saturated all of matter, would you think, would that make thinking about this kind of intuitively really easier? Because everything then would be available for that dual aspect interpretation. So I was going to say, you mentioned our commitment, say, to scientific method. One of the things, obviously, we often forget about scientific method is often the assumption of uniformity. So here with consciousness, we're extracting, that's our kind of default positions, that I've got that here. I presume that the laws of the world are the same over there as well.
Yeah, there is that, and certainly the position that I actually deleted a little bit about reality being uniform in this presentation just because I thought it was kind of surplus, but certainly there is an assumption that's building there. As far as complementarity goes, it wasn't so much, say, a complementarity between photon and wave function as between, photon and wave. Yeah.
Resist that, the sort of pointillistic aspect of the mental and the sort of wide spectrum aspect of what we call physical.
Yeah, sure, okay. And there is also a sense in looking at this where when we're asking questions about consciousness, where to be philosophically rigorous, we have to count the I that is asking from the perspective that is doing the asking in that equally kind of sceptical way about whether the question is coming from a phenomenal or physical point of view. So when you characterise the universe in terms of perhaps matter that's saturated with intelligence, maybe that's interesting, and I'm certainly keen to think about that some more, but that is sort of inherently skewed towards starting with the world and then inferring back to consciousness, and I think that's something we need to be careful about.
That was another interesting point you draw as well, because
sorry, we have to move on and let other people ask questions.
Do you have a view on idealism? The idea that let's get rid of the physical world completely, just say the only things are phenomenal, we don't need the physical world for them anyway, let's just describe the phenomenon as the same.
Yeah. So this is perhaps the solipsism that I was talking about could really be pretty much interchanged on that notion with idealism. The important thing here really is to get something that we can work with, where we can address the questions that we have in a way that kind of satisfies all of our needs, including our need to sort of rigorously assess the world in scientific terms, also make sense of our internal experience. So what I want to say is that there is a validity to that intuition, but if we just take that in itself, it doesn't seem to do all the work that we would want a theory to do in this context.
Thanks for the talk. I just wanted to press you further on the issue of panpsychism and which physical events or so forth would be complemented by phenomena.
Yeah, sure.
You seem to say that it was a matter of intentional or informational events, and I was wondering whether they would be universal or why or why not.
Yeah, okay, so this is the tricky part. We could, for example, just take a Chalmers type of view to this, to say that, Chalmers' view would be that there are certain kinds of intentional states which, by virtue of psychophysical laws, entail certain kinds of phenomenal states, and maybe we could come back and say, well, within the phenomenal realm, there are going to be certain kinds of phenomenal states which are psychophysically, or maybe there's some other word that needs to be used, would entail physical states. I'm trying to avoid that here because want a simpler, more symmetrical approach. And this comes back to the notion that obviously there is a conception of intentionality in on both physical and phenomenal side, but we shouldn't lose sight of the notion that when we're actually looking at intentionality, we're starting with an eye that is looking. We're supposing that there is a phenomenal perspective built into that as well as a physical perspective, so that when we even ask the question, there is a physical and a phenomenal domain next door to each other on this view. So the question itself then is, in a sense, part of that intentionality. The intentionality starts with the question. There's more work to be done here, undoubtedly, to make clear sense of that. And I think that's you've absolutely nailed you've nailed the nail on the head in terms of the most delicate part of the picture.
When Minsky talks about a society of mind and that we're not one self but we're many selves, what does that mean for... the impression I got from that was that we're not actually conscious much of the time. And that we're only conscious when we, say, walk into a door. And that that's an emergent relational kind of thing that happens between two phenomena. So what is the qualia of that? Is what we're talking about qualia as something distinct to be measured, or is it a relation?
Well, what I would say to that is that nothing in here really presumes any psychologically unified sense of self. We're really talking about there's an implied sort of experiencer in the ontology of experience, but there's no reason why that has to be a consistent psychological person in the folk psychological sense, in the way we conceive people. We really can just be looking at isolated experiences, which would be entirely compatible with Minsky's view, or indeed the contemporary neuroscientific view of the mind, which is sort of very modular in that way.
I was intrigued by that question about whether something that was conceivable must necessarily be possible. That's putting it the other way around. If it were true, it would say you could not conceive anything impossible. I would have thought conception was in the realm of imagination and metaphor, as distinct from fact. So I'm not quite sure why that is a real question. Okay, so we're talking about ideal conception here, of a kind that, for example, a superintelligence would be capable of. So a superintelligence that is not conceiving in a freewheeling kind of imaginative way, but is conceiving in terms of its knowledge of the physical universe. Special definition. Yeah. There have been some pretty long papers written just on this question, and certainly for many people the whole debate has come down to the distinction between conceivability and possibility. So maybe we'll make this the last one. I know I've gone on for ages.
I'm just interested in thinking about physicalism, and since we all experience everything subjectively, how can you have a world that's physical? I can see how you can have one that's phenomenology, because we all experience things, but how can you have one that's physical without the eye, without the observer, which is what we are, subjective observer?
Well, I think there are two responses to that. It's totally coherent to imagine an external, objective, physical world, and I'm not personally a skeptic about the existence of one. But this view kind of builds some of that doubt in terms of the notion that the physical and the phenomenological world seem to be kind of on an equal ontological footing if we're going to be strictly philosophically rigorous when we ask the question about how these two domains are related. But I don't think there's anything contradictory in materialism about simply saying that there is a physical world, because when you say that there has to be a phenomenal world to ask questions about the physical world, well, no, there doesn't. There just has to be a cognitive system that can perceive physical events and make rational assessments of them. Thanks so much for your attention. My apologies for going too long. Please enjoy lunch.